My billionaire fiancé left me pregnant at the altar.
He didn't even have the courage to look me in the eyes.
Now he's gonna find out who I really am.
Abandoned at the altar. Pregnant. An embarrassment I never imagined I could go through. I remember every detail of that day, as if time had stopped right there, kept inside me like a photograph that never fades. The dress was white, with lace on the neckline and a long train that I had chosen myself after trying on 14 different options. I had spent months imagining that moment. Not the wedding itself, not the party, not the gifts. I imagined the feeling of walking towards someone I loved, and knowing he loved me back. That's what I wanted. It was that simple. The ceremony was taking place at a private estate on the outskirts of Nashville, one of the oldest families in Tennessee, the Whitmore family. Daniel Whitmore, heir to a fortune built over 3 generations in the energy sector, had proposed to me at an intimate dinner 9 months earlier, with a ring I would never have dared to imagine on my own finger. My name was Claire Bennett, and right then, standing in the anteroom of the chapel, holding a bouquet of white peonies, I still believed everything was going to happen as planned. My maid of honor, Rachel, adjusted my veil for the 3rd time. She was nervous. I noticed, but I chalked it up to the natural nerves of the day. The music started inside. The doors were about to open. That's when one of the wedding coordinators came through the side door with an expression I'll never be able to describe right. It wasn't panic. It was that look of someone who needs to say something and doesn't know how. He approached Rachel first, whispered something. I saw Rachel close her eyes for a second. I asked what was going on. She took a moment to answer, and that silence told me everything before any words were spoken. Daniel wasn't at the altar. There had been no accident, no medical emergency, no logistical issue. He just wasn't there. And in his place was a note, delivered by one of the family's security guards, handwritten on stationery with the initials DW. I read those lines once, then again. Then I carefully folded the paper and slipped it inside my bouquet like it was just another thing. The note said he was sorry, that he had tried to do the right thing, but he couldn't move forward, knowing his heart was somewhere else, that there was someone else, that this person was younger, that they had reconnected weeks ago, and that he couldn't ignore what he was feeling. He didn't mention my pregnancy once. 8 weeks. I had told him 3 days before. I didn't cry right then. That's what people always find the strangest when I tell this story. I didn't fall to the floor. I didn't scream. I didn't need to be held up. I stood there, handed the bouquet back to Rachel, and asked someone to let the guests know the ceremony wasn't going to happen. There were 240 people outside those doors. People who had traveled from out of state. Daniel's mother was there. His business partners, his friends, the entire social structure he had built over a lifetime. And he had chosen to send a note. He thought he knew me, but he was about to find out who I really was. But before I go on, tell me something. I get curious reading the comments. Where are you watching this video from? What city and country? I love knowing where people are listening from. I left through the side door without going through the main hall. I didn't want anyone to see me in that moment, not out of fragility, but because I needed silence to think. The car that took me away was the same one that had brought me. The driver, an older man named Harold who had worked for the Whitmore family for years, didn't say a word the entire ride. Only when we got to the hotel where I was staying, he looked in the rearview mirror and quietly said he was sorry. I thanked him, walked into the room, closed the door, and only then, sitting on the edge of the bed with my wedding dress still on and the veil thrown over the chair, did I let the tears come. Not for the wedding, not for the ring, not for the humiliation in front of 240 people. I cried for the baby growing inside me, and for the man who had decided a younger woman was worth more than all of that. But as I cried, a part of me, small and very quiet, thought about something Daniel Whitmore didn't know. Something I had kept hidden for so long, I had almost forgotten it existed. He didn't know who I really was, and at some point, that was going to matter. In the days that followed, all of Nashville talked about what had happened. I knew it would be like that. When a family like the Whitmores is involved, there is no private version of the story. There's the version they tell, and there's the silence of everyone around them. The version going around was kind to Daniel, as these things usually are. They said it had been a difficult decision, that he had acted out of honesty, that it was better this way than a marriage out of obligation. Someone, at some point, let it slip that I was a beautiful woman, but that Daniel and I were just too different, that I didn't fit into his world. I read that on a local gossip site and stared at the screen for a while. Different. That was the word they had chosen. My lawyer, a woman named Diane, who I'd known for years, called me the next morning to see how I was. She said there were practical matters to sort out, prenups to review, expenses for the canceled ceremony, and that I should think about how I wanted to proceed. I told her I was fine, and that I'd be in touch soon. I still hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy, except Daniel. Rachel knew, because Rachel always knew everything before everyone else, but I had asked her to keep quiet, and Rachel was the only person in the world I trusted completely. I stayed at the hotel for 4 days, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I needed time to organize my thoughts before taking any steps. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, I got a message from Margaret Whitmore, Daniel's mother. She asked to see me. I considered ignoring it, but there was something in the tone of the message, a careful formality that felt different from her usual style, that made me reply. We met at a discreet coffee shop downtown, far from the places the family usually frequented. Margaret got there before me, sitting at a back table with an untouched glass of water in front of her. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, with that posture of someone who has spent her whole life being watched at social events. We had never had a warm relationship. Polite? Yes. Cordial? Always. But warm? Never. She started by saying she was embarrassed. Not for her son, because mothers like Margaret Whitmore don't speak ill of their sons out loud, but for the way things had happened. She said I deserved more than a note. I agreed in silence. Then she said something that stayed with me long after that conversation. She said the girl, the other one, was 23 years old, that Daniel had met her on a trip to Atlanta 3 months prior, that the family didn't know anything until 2 days before the wedding, when he pulled his father aside for a talk. 23. Daniel was 41. Margaret looked down at her hands and said she didn't know what Daniel was thinking, that he probably didn't know either. I asked why she was telling me this. She hesitated. Then she said there was something I needed to know, but she wasn't sure it was her place to say it. I told her to go on. She said Daniel's father, Robert Whitmore, had found out something about me before the wedding, something Daniel never knew, and that Robert had kept this information to himself because he thought it was irrelevant to the marriage, that it was in the past. I asked what it was. Margaret looked at me for a long, silent moment. Then she just said I should talk to my own father. I paid for the coffee, thanked her, and left. I went straight to the hotel, sat on the same edge of the bed where I had cried 4 days earlier, and picked up my phone. My dad lived in Seattle. We didn't talk much, not out of resentment, but out of distance, the kind of distance that grows over the years without anyone making a conscious decision about it. He answered on the second ring, and when I told him what Margaret had said, there was a silence on the other end of the line that confirmed there was something I needed to hear. My dad's name was Thomas Bennett. He was 62, lived in a simple apartment in Seattle, worked as a freelance civil engineering consultant, and had never given me any reason to think there were secrets between us. But on that phone call, as I stood in silence waiting for him to say something after my question, I started to understand that there's a difference between not having secrets and simply never finding the right time to tell certain things. He said he needed to see me in person. I caught a flight to Seattle the next day. My dad was waiting for me at his apartment. There was fresh coffee and a silence that was different from usual, heavier, more careful. He hugged me longer than normal when he opened the door. We sat at the kitchen table. He took a long moment to organize his words. Then he told me. My mother, who had died when I was 12, had a history I didn't fully know. Before marrying my dad, she had been briefly married to another man, a young marriage, before she was 20, that lasted a little over a year and ended due to incompatibility. There were no kids, no drama, just two young people who had married too early and realized their mistake. My mother's ex-husband was a man named Gerald Harmon. The name didn't mean anything to me at first. My dad watched me closely as I processed it. Then he said the full name, Gerald Harmon, founder of Harmon Industries, one of the largest infrastructure companies in the United States, headquartered in Chicago, with branches in practically every construction and engineering sector in the country. A man who had died 6 years ago, with no biological children. A man whose will, I found out in that moment, included a specific clause about my mother. And since my mother had passed away before him, that clause transferred the rights to her only daughter, to me. My dad placed a folder on the table. Inside were documents, correspondence between lawyers, letters Gerald Harmon had sent to my dad years ago, trying to establish contact, a copy of the will with the relevant sections highlighted. Gerald had never forgotten my mother, not in a romantic way. My dad was careful to explain that. But there was a respect, a gratitude for something that had happened during their short marriage. Something Gerald considered a debt he had never been able to repay in life. And in her absence, he had left it to me. My inherited share was approximately $43 million. I stared at the documents for an amount of time I can't quite measure. My coffee got cold. My dad stayed quiet, letting me process it. I asked why he had never told me. He said that when Harmon's lawyers contacted him, I was 26, building my life independently, and he had made the decision, a misguided one, he admitted now, to protect my routine. He had replied to the lawyers saying I would reach out when I was ready, and the years went by. When Daniel and I got engaged, my dad had considered telling me. But he didn't want it to look like there was a financial interest involved, either from me or the Whitmore family, so he stayed silent once again. But Robert Whitmore, Daniel's father, had his own lawyers and his own channels of information, and he found out. He kept it to himself because he thought it was irrelevant. I thought about that for a long moment. A man had left me at the altar for a younger woman without knowing I had more money than he ever imagined I could have. There was something almost absurd in that irony. But it wasn't absurd. It was just life being exactly what it is, full of information that arrives in the wrong order. I called Diane that same night. I said I needed to talk about some legal matters. She said she was available whenever I wanted. I didn't mention the documents yet. I just said there was some news. She replied that it sounded like my life was getting interesting. I told her she had no idea. I went back to Nashville 12 days later. Not because I had to. I could have settled everything from a distance, through the lawyers, without ever having to set foot in that city again. But there was a conversation I wanted to have in person. Not out of anger, not out of a need for confrontation. There was something I needed to say out loud, looking at the right person, so that it would finally stop existing only inside of me. Diane had already contacted the Whitmore's lawyers before I arrived. The issues regarding the canceled ceremony expenses, the prenup guarantees, and other pending matters were being resolved straightforwardly. There was no litigation, no threats. It was a clean negotiation between parties who preferred silence over scandal. What none of the Whitmore's lawyers knew yet was about Gerald Harmon. Diane advised me to keep it quiet for now. The documents were being verified. The inheritance process was running its course, and there was no advantage in announcing anything before it was all formalized. I agreed with her. It was that week that Daniel called me. I wasn't expecting to hear from him. It was almost 10 at night when the phone rang, and when I saw his name on the screen, I froze for a few seconds before answering. He said he needed to talk, that there were things he wanted to explain in person, that he knew he didn't deserve any of my time, but he was asking anyway. I said we could meet the next day. We went to the same restaurant where he had taken me on our first date 3 years earlier. I don't know if it was a deliberate choice on his part or a coincidence. I chose not to ask. Daniel looked different. Not physically. He was the same man, with the same posture, the same habit of adjusting his collar when he was uncomfortable. But there was something missing in him that I couldn't immediately name. It took me a few minutes to pinpoint it. It was the certainty. That quiet confidence that always radiated from him. That air of a man who knows exactly where he's stepping was gone. He started by saying he had made a mistake. That what he had felt for that woman was real, but the way he had acted was indefensible. That leaving me in that moment, like that, with a note, was something he couldn't justify. I listened without interrupting. He mentioned the pregnancy. Said he had thought a lot about it. That he wanted to take responsibility. That he wanted to be present. That he understood if I didn't want anything else from him beyond that. I asked if he was still with her. He hesitated. Then he said no. That they had broken up 2 weeks after the canceled wedding. That he had quickly realized he had confused attraction with something bigger than it was. I didn't respond to that. After a moment, he asked how I was doing. Truly, he said, not just as social protocol. I considered the question carefully before answering. I said I was fine. That I had been through some difficult days, but that I was fine. That I had discovered things about myself and my history that I wasn't expecting, and that those discoveries had somewhat changed the way I looked at the future. He asked what I meant by that. I just said there were matters still being resolved, that when everything was clearer, he would know what he needed to know regarding the baby. That as for the rest, our story was over. He got quiet. Then he asked if there was something he didn't know. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was genuine, as if he sensed there was a dimension to the situation that was escaping him. I looked at him for a moment. I just said there were a lot of things he didn't know about me, and that, contrary to what he might expect, I felt absolutely no need to explain any of them. I paid my half of the bill, got up, and left. Outside, the Nashville air was crisp, with that early autumn smell that always seemed like the most honest of smells to me. I walked to my car without looking back, placed my hand on my stomach for a second, and took a deep breath. There was a whole life ahead, and for the first time in weeks, that sounded like good news. The following months were quiet, in the way only important months can be. The inheritance was settled in less time than Diane had initially estimated. The firm handling Gerald Harmon's estate was competent and organized, and once all the documents were verified and the legal processes ran their course, the transfer happened seamlessly. No noise, no headlines, no public drama. $43 million. Plus the accumulated interest since Gerald's death, which the lawyers had carefully managed over the years while waiting for me to show up. I stared at the numbers on my bank statement for a long time the day the transfer was confirmed. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. It wasn't euphoria or relief, or that cinematic sense of victory. It was something quieter than that. A kind of settling, like when a loose piece finally finds its place. I called my dad right after. He answered and asked how I was. I said I was fine, that I had received the confirmation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, I could tell he was emotional. I didn't say anything about it. I just thanked him, without specifying for what, and he understood. Diane made sure the information stayed discreet. There was no legal obligation to make anything public, and I had no interest in headlines. What I had was mine, and I didn't need anyone to know about it for it to be real. But Nashville is a small town when you know the right people, and the right people talk. I found out, a few weeks later, through Rachel, that the Whitmore family had found out. I don't know how I didn't ask for details, or I only knew that Robert Whitmore had called Daniel in for a talk, and that the conversation had not been pleasant. Robert was a man who valued strategic intelligence above all else, and finding out that his son had abandoned at the altar a woman who inherited a fortune comparable to theirs was, in his language, a severe miscalculation. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that, or maybe I felt a little. It would be dishonest to say I didn't. Daniel called me once after that. Just once. I didn't answer. He didn't leave a message. The pregnancy went well. I moved to Seattle to be closer to my dad during the final months. I found a spacious apartment in a quiet part of the city, with large windows that let in that soft, gray light Seattle has in the winter months. I started working remotely on a consulting project I had accepted before the wedding, which had been on hold while my life fell apart and rearranged itself. I found out I was having a girl. I thought a lot about the name, spent weeks with lists on my phone, crossing out and adding. In the end, I chose a name that had belonged to my mother as a middle name. Something of mine. Something of hers. A continuation. My dad was in the waiting room when she was born. When the nurse called him in, he stood at the door of the room for a few seconds, looking at the two of us, and I will never forget the expression on his face. It was the face of someone looking at the future and realizing it's better than he expected. Daniel was informed of the birth through the lawyers, as we had agreed. He responded within the deadline, expressed his desire to be present in his daughter's life, and the terms were established civilly. He never asked me for any more explanations, maybe out of respect, maybe because he already knew enough. I think about that day in Nashville sometimes. The white dress, the peonies, the note folded inside the bouquet. I think about how certain I was that I knew what my future looked like, and how the future had completely different ideas. I don't hold a grudge against Daniel. Not because what he did was acceptable, because it wasn't. But because a grudge is a weight I chose not to carry. I have a daughter who smiles in a way that completely undoes me. I have a dad who calls me every week, and sometimes just talks nonsense for half an hour. And that is exactly enough. I have a job that challenges me. I have a life I built with my own two hands, even when it felt like there was no solid ground beneath my feet. He didn't know who I was, but I knew. Deep down, even when I cried alone in that hotel room with my wedding dress still on, I knew. And sometimes that is enough. If this story touched you in some way, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps bring new stories, and it means a lot knowing there's someone on the other side listening. I hope to see you in the next video.